Hi, my name is Benedict. I've had a couple of people ask my take on this new instrument. It is Friktion model strings from the Reason Studios people. I've actually done a bit of an ask around, and it seems that it probably was made entirely in-house. Not that I really care where anything comes from, but I had some thoughts that maybe there were certain other well-known devs behind this, but no, it seems like it's probably their little ball of wax. Now, it's a very interesting proposal, Friktion, because it's a physically modelled synth. Now, physical modelling's a bit arcane and quite honestly I think has been somewhat underdeveloped in the broader market. We'll talk about that after, but that's what this looks like. The first thing that I want to go through is that I want to actually show you in comparison to other instruments. Lots of people are just talking about Friktion and going through the Captain Obvious, this knob does that, and I'll actually say at the beginning, I think the manual is 9/10 of useless. Sorry guys, but I think you're kind of letting yourselves down there in the sense that saying that the accent knob changes the accent is like, okay, thanks. I'd like a lot more depth in that to actually explain what this does, why, how does it represent, what would happen if we had ourselves a real fiddle. A lot of it I probably have worked out. Some stuff really could use more depth, and I know that 99.9% of people are not going to read it, but I miss those days where like a Casio CZ manual would really give you a whole primer on everything you needed to know to use the instrument deeply. And this is one that I think that begs to be used deeply if you want to get your own thing out of it. So I've, as I said, used several different sounds and we'll play through them. They're all assigned to the same delay and reverb. So if an onboard reverb or effect was included in that particular instrument, it's off. So we're getting as reasonably level playing field as we can. So if we get that out of the way, all assigned to the send effects. Let's see what it sounds like. We'll start with Friktion. They're all playing the same thing, the same bit of MIDI with the same bit of mod wheel. Some of these instruments respond to it, some of them don't. Friktion itself. This next one is actually the violin, the long violins from the orchestra package. People don't talk about it anymore and it's a very dry sounding thing, but when you use it and you treat it properly, it's actually really nice. Next, because I've got it, and it's pretty easily available, the BBC Symphony Orchestra from Spitfire. This is the Discovery, so it's far from a detailed package. You will notice straight away that this is a violin section, not a single violin. This next one is the orchestra. Sonus scores the orchestra, so it's a bit of a bigger package, not getting right up into a full package, but a bit of a bigger package. This again is a group of violin and this one does have a legato because the BBC Discovery doesn't have a legato mode. This has a legato mode built in, which Friktion does, but orchestra doesn't. what you'll notice is that the sample orchestras really have a strong set of decisions made about how those instruments are going to sound, which works in a mix or doesn't work in a mix. You're going to love or you're not going to love. This one is Europa. This is a patch of my own creation, pure Europa. And then essentially the same thing using an NXT. Speaking of T, I'll run through these again. I'll keep my gob shut in between, just to give you a sense of how they compare. They are not meant to be the same. They're not meant to be clones of each other. Just to give you a sense of how these things behave and to help you hear the difference with Friktion. So same notes exactly, same performance, but you just hear how each of those brings it out differently. Obviously, these two guys, they have sections, and that gives you that section-y sound, which is really nice. So it's to get that big, fat, smooth, silky string thing, it works much better. Now, Friktion does have a mode that will do this. But let's be honest, it doesn't really nail it. So this is a sound completely of my own creation. It's not actually a preset. No doubt I started with a preset, but it was a case of going through and going, this does this, this does that, and this is where I ended up with something that I felt like at the time, oh, that makes a nice fiddle. Again, I'm not going to go too much through the instrument because everybody else has done the obvious thing. This video is more for those of you who are going, yeah, look, I've watched all those other videos. They all said the same thing. Now I want to see something different. Doubling, very easy. You're going to go, oh, but I want to make a section now. So I want to get that sort of Mozart-y, lovely, sweeping thing. It is possible to get it to sound fairly nice, but it's always going to be more of a string quartet section than an orchestral section. It gives you up to 4 players, 2, 3 or 4 players. You can adjust the randomness of the timing with you can start to hear the as each of the instrument players plays a little loose. Interesting, but it's more mathematical than real feeling. The other thing that you can do, which does help a lot, is the smear is generally set to being in exactly the same position. Oh, that's nice, Steam. Thank you. Bye-bye. So you get a very exactly the same. Now, my understanding of this is that it's an impulse response. Anybody who follows me knows I'm not big on impulse responses as reverbs. Generally have struggled to use them, but this is very interesting. It definitely has a impact. And they are able to impart a noticeable difference upon the sound, and you can then... So that's probably just changing the playback speed of that impulse. Doesn't get super technical, but it seems to be plus minus an octave in terms of size. You can pull in some of the direct sounds, so which is the same as here we are without any kind of box imparted upon it. That stays very much the same. It's same. Smear somehow moves around. Not super noticeable, but it does soften an instrument if you are just using it solo, legato. It does smear around, and I think it gives you a slightly less sterile or synthy sound. If you're thinking you're going to get realism out of this, as the advert suggests, please, you're not. You will get an interesting character sound. The smear takes some of the edge off the it's the same sound over and over again. When used with doubling, it does really help to give the sense of them being different, because the reality is, even if you have four fiddlers standing there, odds on that they haven't bought all their fiddles from the same shop at the same time, so they're not the same factory run instrument. They're probably four different instruments that they bought from four different manufacturers at four different times. So that's four different trees, assuming only one tree goes into a violin. So there's a fair amount of variety that even if they all had the same size violin, which as adults they probably do, the reality is that those four fiddles, to keep my alliteration, will not actually sound the same as each other. So we are being given a fudge to say, yeah, we'll use this basic violin shape, but we'll fudge it around. And it kind of works, but in terms of getting a nice, smooth, flowing string section, it won't happen out of this. That's where you're best either going back to a sample set, or I spent some time, and I didn't save any of them off, I probably should have. I spent some time combining an instance of Friktion, in a combinator, an instance of Friktion with actually just the ID8 strings and a Thor string patch that I made. So you could pick the bits that you liked about each of those individual sounds, mix them together, and you get the lead that Friktion does very nicely. It's a real character lead sound. That pulls that forward, and then you get the gloss and the smooth and the lovely swish out of the samples and the synthesis together. So using Thor's multi-oscillator, one or two of those, just with nice little bit of filtering, maybe roll off some of the lows, put them all through the same reverb, so they're obviously in the same space, and you can get more of that great big Mozart-y string section, not using Friktion to play the whole thing, but to merely put kind of a character on the front of it, which your ear hears, and then kind of leads that back to the rest of what's behind it. As you'll hear playing some of these, now the orchestra is actually really good. It's actually a more realistic violin sound, and you go, duh, Benedict, because it's a sample. But not all samples sound great. This is... lacking in dynamics and expression, but there would be ways to... control that more, and that might mean getting into setting up more of your own controllers, maybe even putting them into a combinator and setting up your overall level controller, which is what is happening here with our mod wheel. Because what happens with fiddle players is that they press harder and softer, and they become very, very lyrical. It's an incredibly lyrical instrument, and the problem with synthesis and samples is that they just can't carry that lyricism. However, you can achieve a lot. Even with simple old orchestra, you've got it. It's quite dry on its own, but as soon as you, like if we kill off these guys, sounds very thin because they've recorded that really tight. I mean, I don't know what the recording setting is, but they sure haven't gone into Abbey Road and used the great big scoring stage there. They've kept this really dry, which is actually really quite nice because you can add in your own whatever room you want. It's a nice thing, but you just got to, when you go in, realise that it's going to be awfully dry to start with. The BBC SO is, let me go rescue that back off my other monitor. The BBC is a nice thing, absolutely brilliant for either 49, I think it is, or if you fill in their survey, nothing. Like most things, it's got a dynamic slider here. Very limited options in what you can do here. But unlike the orchestra setup, you've got to have a different instrument for each articulation. Which brings us back to what Friktion does, and does really quite nicely. So you've got nice. It really is. You can get into things like harmonics, which, to be honest, I don't really know how to use. I know what they are in theory. If you break the string part way up, then suddenly it plays a harmonic of the actual note, Pythagorean Pythagoration. But in terms of a player, I'm not going to say I know how to use them. If you want to hear them in use, listen to ZZ Top, Slip and Slide My Sleeping Bag, or Rough Boy, or any of those things. They're playing along, and suddenly the note they play is not the note you expect, but it's somehow the right note. They're just picking harmonics rather than the actual note. Cool stuff if you know what you're doing with it. Mono and... oh, you can turn vibrato on and off. So just the... that built in is really quite elegantly done, and I'm not showing all of those things. You've even got an auxiliary, as in a assign this to whatever the hell you want button through the mod matrix. There's not a lot of mod matrix, but I think there's enough. So you've got quite a lot of options. You can just press the button and it changes what the instrument is doing, which is a little more like these, except I'll be honest and say that unless I'm missing something with the BBC Discovery, at least, there doesn't seem to be a way to change articulations on the fly. So just like orchestra, if you want to switch from legato to spiccato, you actually have to have two instances. But for the price, can't bitch, won't bitch. The next one is the orchestra. It's a more expensive package, not reviewing orchestra at all. You've got the usual same sort of thing. We can now remember that is a section, not a single instrument. So comparing head to head with Friktion is not entirely fair, but it's the kind of thing that you get, and you've heard a single sound coming out of orchestra. The advantage of these is that they give you all of those different articulations, like a Mikado here. Is different, but you can do this in Friktion just by really taking the time to understand how these articulations work. You can either just go bull at a gate and say, well, that's what I want, and who gives a... and that's perfectly okay. But kind of like a spiccato, kind of. So you can set your decay time here, which is how long your attack process. So that's how you can get your faster articulations. By adding some attack, you can actually soften up a lot of the falseness. And add variety. That's going to depend upon what you're trying to achieve. So you're either going to come in and go, okay, that's what I'm hearing in this sound, and use that. And the more you use these ways of moving this instrument, the better it's going to sound. If you simply say, there's a violin, it's going to sound as pasted on as anything else, just like any synthesizer or anything like that. So it's in... including what sound like... that's what it excels at. Not really sounding like a violin, but the ability for movement that is not generally there in your average synthesizer. They've focused this down on how a string player might perform, and that's where its real strength lies. The fact that it sounds a bit violin-y is the bonus and helps make it work. Now, what was the other thing? Yes, we've got glide modes in here. The default time that it gives you here is, let's turn it on, rather long. They do have a clever mode with auto, so you can set your no glide, no glide, glide. Now, obviously in a violin, there's only so far in which you could glide from one note to another, and it's based upon whether you're on the same string. Now, if you're on the same string and you're good enough to go zit zit, then yes, you could have a massive glide. Often that's done in a tremolo type situation. Done that with my daughter's violin. But as you slur from one note to another, so that can just be slurring with your fretting or slurring across your strings. This doesn't have all the detail and intricacy of how that's really going to sound, but so long as you're careful. The downside of their default setting is that with a slow setting, not so bad. But it can sound more like a Chinese one-string violin than, a good old-fashioned English violin. But if you pull your time right down, that can work quite nicely. I think probably the more you get into playing this as a complex instrument, the more you're probably going to want to look at automating this little fella as well, because sometimes you'll want to articulate how those slurs happen. Sometimes a slur will be really fast, other times it will be quite, let's take our time with that. So the fact that it doesn't automatically have a thing is probably just because they know there's only so many controllers we're likely to be using at any given time. Glide doesn't seem to be there, so you might have to combine that, use a combinator to control that, or merely set it in your automation. But it will make a difference if you are using slurs if they move around over time, and that's all just going to depend on your patch and what you're playing. But think about that carefully. If you're not used to playing a violin or don't know how it works, you can say, I can do whatever I want, and you can. And you can create your own feel out of that. But if you're just saying, I'll randomly do this, and that'll make it sound like a violin, it'll probably make it sound less like a violin. Because even though we may not personally know all the mechanics of fiddling, we can actually tell when it's been fiddled with. So go carefully. The more you want to make this sound real or authentic, or have people feel like there's some old Italian scratching away downstairs, the more you're going to need to understand the mechanics of what that old guy would be doing. So just that big warning there. Don't just wade in and throw shit everywhere and think that that's what you want it to sound like. Understand the mechanics, because there's a lot of understanding the mechanics going behind this. The more you do that, the more you'll get something that resonates in the ear of anyone who's ever heard a violin. But if you want to just go, bugger it, I'm making my own weird thing, that's really cool. Then automate all kinds of random shit and make things strange sizes and... There's a patch in there that supposedly sounds like a fart bag. Gone, bloody Scots. Doesn't really sound like that at all, but we can give impressions of those things, just like any synthesist. So comparing to the orchestra, we can get that more straight, here's an orchestra in a nice room sound. That's not reverb. I gotta say, I really do struggle with the the ability to get those really nice, soft, flowing lines. You can do the nice lead flowing, but string section type stuff, again, that Mozart-y sound, it's not that it's not there. I haven't found out how to do it, but I'm not convinced that it will do it easily. Love to be wrong, but going through the presets, none of them actually sounded like what you will get. And that's only a section. If we went into here and thanks Steve, and used one of the multis in here, which is a whole pile of violins, cellos, what have you, all piled up together, we're going to get that beautiful orchestra-y sound. It's not in Friktion, but that's okay. It's not necessarily what it's designed to do. This is one you're probably going to think, well, why are we doing this as a bloody synthesizer? And I said, well, what do you think Friktion is as a synthesizer? Like Friktion, with care and understanding of what you're looking to achieve, and understanding that you can probably only achieve this, a real violin's articulation and variety, even with a reasonable performer, is like this. But if we say, okay, I'm going to focus on this many attributes, I'm going to say, look, I'm going to allow myself, say, 3 attributes in which this sound moves, then we can do surprisingly well. Obviously your waveforms, if you get something that's more violin-y, here I've dropped off some of the fundamental to thin that out, because the violin doesn't have a strong fundamental. Lots of overtones, not a lot of fundamental. And again, that's a case of taking your time and deciding what's priority in the sound that you're creating. The best way to work out what's priority in the sound that you're creating is to know what the story you're telling is. If it's a tough story, then you're probably wanting a stronger body in your instrument. If it's a weepy story, then you probably want less fundamental and more of the... Or you might even say, look, we're not going to have that super bright, and that's all going to come down to the story you're trying to tell. The more you can understand the story you're trying to tell, the easier it is to make sounds that are actually going to do that job. They will not be as articulate as Friktion, but the more you work on it and the more you set up controllers and automations and what have you, the more you can give the sense that these instruments not are real, but they act like they're real. If you listen to Garden Emerging Waters, there's a lot of Japanesey kind of stuff in there. A lot of those you could think are samples. Not a damn sample in the thing. It's all synthesis. And in this, see, we're all obsessed with samples. It's just a sample, which... it's one of my own, something I made, probably off Thor or whatever. I've imported here, it's transposed across the range. Gets nice and synthy down here. Nice synth cello. Will sit beautifully in a mix. If you were using a cello sound in your Friktion and wanting to give it more body, because the Friktion sounds are prone to being thin and stringy, like stringy meat. And I'm not having a go, that's just the nature of physical modelling. It's hard to get that nice body. That's where they've done quite a nice job with this resonator thing, but you're still going to struggle with it. So you could take your cello here, set your line up, and then back it with something like this. And the two together, when you find that right balance, you might even choose to compress them together or EQ them together, something that just gloms them into one. You'll end up with a nice rich sound. I made another video recently which was about that. It was about brass sample plus synthesis and getting this really impressive sound. So all different ways of attacking the same thing, but where Friktion really excels is in being its own kind of instrument. And the more I think that you're able to say, okay, that's how this thing does it, then the more you're going to be able to work out what you want. Now, the other thing, your things like the orchestra have, actually will show you. We'll kill this guy off. Save changes, no. Instruments, no, I don't want them. We want this fella. This is sort of the core, the performance side of it. Let's make sure we're alive. And that's a sound we've all come to know and, well, personally almost hate, because it's just what everybody does and what they think orchestras actually sound like. So, of course, we're going to be asking, will Friktion do it? It doesn't sound very nice with chords, to be perfectly honest. But let's turn on this. If I took this and attached it to the orchestra, there'd be no appreciable difference between what I played you coming out of their box and being driven by this. Controlled that down here already, so it's not worth messing around with. There's something I didn't play with before. The stereoization thing here sounds very false to me, so that was why I'd gotten rid of it. I'd rather put my stereo in somewhere else, through my room reverbs, or if I'm getting into chorusing or something like that. But in this situation, seeing this is such a false thing anyway, it actually works fairly nicely. So as you see, once you've got your musical line, I think it's much better to set up your instrument then. So you can say, okay, here's my musical line, here's my story, here's what these fine fiddlers are supposed to be helping people to be feeling, all those Fs. Then you can look around, you can say, well, what are my options here? Do I want this to be brighter, more focused on the musicality, the notes, or I've got that automated. So you can pick and choose then what you're doing. Something else to be aware of. It's a fudge, and I wondered how it worked, and then I realized that there was this little transpose octave thing here. Because you've lost your bottom octave of your keyboard, they've put it at C1 rather than C0. It's easy to access because most people have a C1 on their keyboard or can access it easily. C0 is easier in a sequencer setup because you can still play C1, but to get there... So be careful that the instrument defaults to playing an octave below. Now it sounds good, because a cello always sounds better than a violin. Fight! But it does, because it's bigger, it's richer. So if you take a cello and a violin playing the same note, you'll find that the cello actually sounds nicer, because it's a bigger body, it's got more resonance. Doesn't make it right. The violin has a very great purpose with its small, weeny, pathetic body, sounding stringy and like, well, a bloody violin. But be aware here, I'm joking. When this starts an octave down, yes, it's giving you access to this missing octave. But if you feed it a line, let's say you've downloaded a Mozart MIDI file and you assign everything to hear the whole things. So be careful. You're better off staying with 0 for your violin lines. If you are playing a bass, then far too much for a bass to play. Sounds like heavy metal. But you see, once you understand what you're looking for in terms of the music and you know what you want to express there, it's actually not that hard to go, okay, if I move this and I move this and I move this, because you understand then what you're looking for. So the best way to get the most out of this is to say, look, I've got my musical performance. How do I make this instrument with its options, which are limited? Remember, violin can do this many. Synth, well, you know, Friktion can probably do this many. A standard synth can probably do this many. You can then start going through and going, okay, well, that's... what I'm looking for. Kind of interesting if this was smooth rather than fixed. It might sound really weird, but it's interesting too. You can hear a pop, but if you do it in the right place, the pop actually sounds like it's part of the performance. And you see there, just by making a small change, we can make our instrument move. That's a nice thing. It's probably an unintended thing, but you can work with that. So you can get that kind of thing out of it, but you're going to need to understand your articulations. Again, my advice is, if you do that, set that up with your arpeggiators here, which are really very simple. Remember to turn the velocity up or you hear nothing. That you're just setting what plays when. And most of the time with these, big library things, the orchestra, we're just hearing, well, the cello is at -1 and the double bass are at -1, so they're just playing an octave below. The engine is, look, the same thing. It's just playing the whole chord, hammering those out at 1/8. We're not messing around with any of the others, but it's got a rhythm attached to it. So first, and that moves around a little bit. So it's moving around more than I've got here, but by the way those move around, obviously that sounds better because it's got things recorded in a room and lots of instruments. This has got one. But nonetheless, you can do this if you want to take the time to build things up, but just don't expect that it's going to sound the same as a big package which contains whole sections of the thing. But I think if you get this thinking you're going to be getting a real cello, a real violin and what have you, you probably kind of missed what this is, despite the fact that they advertise it that way. It's artistic license, marketing license, whatever you want to call it. The basses are nice. Let's turn that off. That just gets bloody annoying. But I can tell you they do not have the depth of, say, these guys. Where are my these? In a mix, that's just gorgeous. The Daedalus in Danger film, the little film that I did with Jane, when the ship explodes towards the end, you feel this great big woof, and that oof is actually the basses out of there, which couldn't do it with a synth, and Friktion will also not give you the same. While you get the top part pretty right, you just don't get the body because it's not going through. Oops, basses. That one's a bit more like it. Not that I can really tell through. So it's very much an instrument that's not going to replace a sample set, but with some care or wild abandon, you can get some rather beautiful things out of it. My concern will be that a lot of people will grab it and go, well, that sounds just... And we'll see release of tracks that have some rather obvious use of it. Fair enough, as long as it doesn't end up becoming an awfully cliched sound, and then it'd be like... But hopefully with care, and if people are creating their own sound and understanding the mechanics of it, or breaking it in cool ways, then it's an instrument that's narrow in its focus, but quite broad in what you can get out of it. Once you get the sense of, well, this is my musical line, this is a story I need this instrument to help me tell, and then you massage the instrument to make it tell that, which is exactly what the old Italian dude is doing. It's easy for him because he's been doing it for a very long time, and he's really learnt to massage that lump of wood and gut and horsehair to give all that lyrical feeling. We will have to spend our time going, how do I get that feeling out of this? And that's all the stuff that I talk about all the time, and it's just about tone over time and space. So, is it bright? Is it dark? What are we trying to say here? And the more you can put that in at the beginning, the less you need to worry about that as a mix engineer. Because if it's not there, it's hard to put it in. There are fudges you can do that will give the illusion, but if you've got something that's supposed to be sort of warm and solid, and you've got that built into the performance, which I think is very, very able to be achieved here with time and care and understanding, then it's going to mix really, really nicely. And it will be a fascinating instrument to see what people do with it, and also to see if it's going to end up becoming kind of like a DX7 or a D50. It's one of those sounds like, Friktion preset. Step past the presets. It's not that they're bad, it's just they're a starting off point for finding your own thing. Because you'll see, even just if you've been patient and listened to what I've done here, you'll hear the performance change as we whittle the knobs. If you've got questions about, anything involved in this, or of course anything at all, please ask me down below. Always happy to help. Extremely eager to be doing genuine mix work for people. You have a good day now.